Thank you, Ray, and thank you also to the Center for International Development for organizing this event and including me in it. I am going to talk primarily about homicides of women today, femicides, and there was a nice segue, a nice transition here in this last component of the conversation that we were just having with Carl and Victor's research. Specifically, this one of the last comments here that was made about some organizations, criminal organizations, not wanting to be observed, right? Not wanting to be seen. So that's essentially what we're talking about with latent phenomena. And if we're talking about human trafficking, trafficking in persons as one of these sort of hard to see, hard to recognize, hard to identify phenomena, then what can we do to try to identify it, to try to see it perhaps through indirect ways? So I'm trying to take some closely related phenomena, right, the killing of women, to try to identify some patterns in that outcome of interest that might yield some insights about the underlying outcome of interest. Similarly, we might take some of the approaches that were mentioned here at this table, right, specifically statistical models, generate what we think might be a reasonable approximation of the state of the art in terms of modeling this outcome of interest, right, femicides, and then pay attention not to the findings themselves, but to the remaining unexplained component in that model, right? What we sort of typically call the error term or the residuals in any statistical model, and look for systematic structure in that unexplained component. That is, take what we don't know, right? Or take what we know to learn something about what we don't know, and then look at structure in what we don't know, specifically geographic structure in what we don't know, to try to learn something about this underlying phenomenon of interest. So I'm going to walk through a couple of steps, a couple of illustrations of what that might look like. I'm going to show you a bunch of maps, but I'm basically going to focus on three techniques. If I move away from the microphone, does my voice decay?
Or you can take one of these.
I'm okay. I had a professor who used to say it was like a shark that needed to move around in order to breathe. Sometimes I feel the same way. So this isn't the universe of possible approaches that you could take, but these are three interesting approaches that you could take to try to understand, take what you know to try to understand something about what you don't know, right? Try to understand something about this latent phenomenon. So the first thing that I'm going to walk through is looking at geographic clustering, spatial clustering of a closely related outcome of interest, namely femicides, right? To see if we can learn something by studying those patterns about our true object of interest, right? Human trafficking or trafficking networks or criminal organizations, criminal networks. Then I won't show you the estimated mathematical model, but there's a mathematical model in the background that is what I previously called a sort of reasonable approximation to the state of the art. We're going to focus on that remaining unexplained component, right, and look at the geographic distribution of that component, right, the error term or the residual term. And then there are lots of reasons to think that these, whether it's relational connections in the framing of networks, or it's geographic connections in the framing of spatial analysis, or other forms of interdependence, there are strong reasons to think that what happens in place A is related to what happens in place B. That is, that there are spillover, diffusion, feedback effects, right, from one location to another. And then we have tools to examine those spillover and feedback effects. So then we might be looking for patterns in those spillover and feedback effects that might, again, teach us something about the underlying structures of connections between a closely related phenomenon of interest in one place and that same outcome of interest in another place. So again, we're kind of focusing on patterns of femicides, but for the purpose of trying to learn something about these structures that are interesting to us about the latent phenomenon, right? Which are the criminal networks, the trafficking of persons that are either hard to see, we have little data on, or are actively evading our detection. So first of all, let's look at the first one of these, the geographic clustering of a related outcome. So I'm going to show you a series of maps. This is a map of homicides of women in Brazil in 2011, 2012. It's kind of this smoothed, is it 2000? I think I had a 2-year average here, just smoothing it over across 2 years. The darker regions, these are all municipalities. Brazil is a federal country like the United States. Instead of having 50 states, it has 27, but it's also composed, the United States is composed of roughly 3,100 counties, and the equivalent subnational unit in Brazil would be the municipality. Brazil is composed of roughly 5,600 municipalities, so these are the femicide rates using a standard comparative measure. Murders of women per 100,000 people, per 100,000 population, so this is a measure that's broadly used comparatively. And the darker colorings, the darker shadings are identifying those municipalities that have the highest rates. So you see it ranges from 0 in the blank areas, so no women killed, right, in those blank areas, to over 100 women killed per 100,000 people in the dark areas. I don't know how many people are familiar with homicide statistics here in the United States, but the average per year recently has been about 5 per 100,000. And in our worst cities here in the United States, we might have 4 or 5 each year, right? Baltimore, Flint, that might go above 35, maybe reach 50 homicides per 100,000. And there are dozens of municipalities in Brazil that exceed 100 femicides. This is not even including men, right? Just 100 femicides per 100,000 population. So that's an interesting pattern in and of itself. But what we're interested in understanding is, given this sort of the distribution of these raw values, can we learn something by the spatial association, right? Are high levels of femicide rates closely connected geographically to other high femicide rates? Are places with high femicide rates closely proximate, right, to other units with high femicide rates? Or are these pretty randomly distributed around Brazil? If we do see anything that looks like clustering, then that tells us that something is going on either between those units. There's either some kind of spillover, transfer, contagion, diffusion process, or those units are being exposed to something in common, right? They have a shared influence, right? Maybe there isn't some kind of transmission between the units, but they're being exposed to something that's shared. So this is what those spatial clusters look like. Lots of people use different terminology for these. You might have heard people refer to these as hot spots, maybe cold spots. Some of these maps can look very complicated if they contain a lot of information. I've tried to simplify it so that you just see what looks, it should look like red. The coloring is a little bit off, but the red municipalities identify statistically significant cores of hotspots. So that municipality that's identified in red is the core, along with all of its neighbors, which are not colored in, right? So there's lots of blank, the clusters are larger than just the units that are colored in. But every one of those red units is the core, the center. It's a focal unit in a statistically significant pattern, geographic pattern, of a higher than average femicide rate connected to neighbors that also have higher than average femicide rates. So every one of these locations, dozens of clusters around Brazil, tell us that there is something transmitting, right? There's something being transferred or shared across the boundaries of these municipalities that is leading to higher than average femicide rates, or all of these units are being exposed together to something that is influencing these higher than average femicide rates. The blue locations are cold spots or locations, statistically significant cores of locations of clusters that have lower than average femicide rates. So these might also be interesting to learn something about, right? Or especially taking both of them side by side. There's been lots of mention of mixed methods research, right? But this would be a nice rationale or motivation for a case study, a comparative case study, right? A small N case study design. Why not go to one of these locations that has one of these higher statistics that are measured capturing association, and one of the ones where the femicide rates are higher than average, and compare that to a set of cases that have lower than average femicide rates. And again, you'd be looking for vectors of transmission across the municipalities. Are there networks that are working across jurisdictional boundaries that might help explain this pattern? Or are the units being exposed to something in common? Some people refer to that kind of explanation as a common shock or common exposure hypothesis. Just for comparison's sake, I'm going to show this. So these are the clusters, the statistically significant clusters for femicides. I'm going to show you the clusters for all homicides. That's all homicides in Brazil. This is men only. Again, all homicides, men. There's a big swath across the middle of the country, right, that doesn't seem to shift. But then going back to femicides, right, it's quite different again. With thinking about criminal networks, trafficking of persons, some of the clusters that are particularly interesting to me are the ones that are near international boundaries, especially if they're near major border crossings. So Ciudad del Este in Paraguay, right down near the southern part. It doesn't show up as a statistically significant cluster, but that's one of the things that I'd be looking for, right? A major sort of hub of criminal trafficking organizations, international criminal organizations. But this location up in the top, in the northwestern part of Brazil, kind of looks like a dog's head facing west. It's actually called the dog's head, cabeza do cachorro. But there's lots of qualitative, at least anecdotal evidence that's suggesting high levels of trafficking of women in those locations. Right? These are major migrant points of departure from Brazil, and there's at least anecdotal qualitative evidence that suggests that trafficking might be one of the mechanisms underlying that pattern. So something else that you might do that I anticipated, right, is gather more data, learn more about the kinds of theories that have been put on the table here. I'm always consistently impressed by how closely the explanations, the theory about political violence matches or mirrors or is analogous to the theories and explanations about ordinary criminal violence. So it's something that I've always wanted to delve deeper into. But you could take a set of hypotheses, build up a reasonable approximation of the state of the art, and try in a statistical model to test all these various hypotheses against each other. As I said before, I won't show you that model. The quantity of interest for me is that remaining unexplained component. What is left over? Once you've accounted for maybe all of the dominant explanations, what's left over? And is that really just random noise, or is there some kind of structure in that noise, right? Is there a remaining signal in that noise? Specifically, I'm interested in geographic signals. So this is what that looks like, taking that same idea of looking for spatial clusters in that unexplained component. Again, there are dozens of statistically significant clusters, right? Spatial associations of this unexplained component. This to me strongly suggests signal, right? Not noise. And the question here then is, well, how can we take maybe somebody with in-depth case knowledge of each of these locations, right? This might be a pitch to IRB, right? I'm thinking about how to pitch this in the future, right? But doing in-depth case studies in these locations to try to tease out the mechanisms underlying this pattern, right? Thinking about human subjects research and the risks potentially to research assistants, et cetera. But again, these are strongly suggestive of non-random patterns, right? Again, there's some kind of geographic signal in what would otherwise be dismissed, or what analysts, researchers tend to dismiss as noise. This is just another visualization with the municipal boundaries, so that you can see that a lot of these what look like single clusters or single municipalities are actually multiple municipalities next to each other. And again, just a reminder that each one of these units is the core of a cluster that includes all of the surrounding units, right? So the unit of observation is the municipality, but the object of a case study here would be the set of relevantly connected units, right? And then lastly, I spoke about spillover feedback effects. You can take this kind of analysis one step further, and given the nature of interdependence, the effect of any one of these covariates is not restricted to the unit itself, right? The effect of any one of these predictors of violence, whether it's poverty, unemployment, inequality, etc., spills out from that unit and interacts with, right? You could say interferes with the causal process in other units. So we have tools to examine that. And what this graph or this map tells you, this is the percentage of the variation in femicides in any given unit that is explained by how the predictor spills out from unit A into all of its neighbors and its neighbors' neighbors and it's the neighbors of its neighbors' neighbors, and then feeds back into the unit. And so if you look at the legend on the right, it ranges from about 0 to 0.15. At the top end, that's saying that 15% of the variation in femicides is explained not by within unit dynamics, but by what's happening in one's neighbor's neighbors. Okay? So you can see that there's a lot of variation in that, and we can leverage this kind of variation, right? That some of these units are influenced more, right? Are impacted more by what's going on in their neighbors than what's going on within the unit itself. And I'm just going to highlight down at the bottom, my eyes were sort of drawn to the darker units. There are several of them that are up at the top end of this range. But if you're familiar with Brazil at all, you see that down towards the southeastern end, there's a dark spot, and I just kind of magnified it. And does anybody know what that city shape is? Sort of a classic shape of the city of Sao Paulo, right? This one's mega cities. But what that's saying is that 15%, a full 15% of the variation in the murders of women in Sao Paulo is not explained by what's happening within Sao Paulo. It's explained by what's happening outside Sao Paulo. And so we can tease this apart even further and identify which municipalities are responsible for that sort of extra unit interference or influence. For me, this is all in the service of mixed methods designs, right? I like doing this kind of statistical modeling, but I'm always looking for opportunities to identify cases like this, right? And then take the statistical properties and go and investigate this and see how it plays out on the ground, right? Using a more in-depth textured process. So I'll finish there just with a summary of the main points here. There are multiple other techniques that you could use, but I've illustrated how you could use geographic clustering an outcome of interest, of a closely related outcome of interest, to try to learn something about the latent phenomenon that we're interested in. You could also estimate a larger mathematical model and then look for that, try to identify that unexplained component and look for geographic structure in that error term. And then we have tools available that help us detect the spillover feedback effects among units, right? Trying to get a firmer grasp of the interdependence among these units. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.